sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service
The number
at this
you have
time.
dialed has been changed. The new number is...
Welcome to Interstate Odyssey. I'm your host, Sophie Peterson. If you like learning about obscure, fantastical, and even some potentially haunted places throughout America, you've come to the right place. Each week, I'll be covering different roadside attractions throughout the United States. The good, the bad, and the absolutely strange. Welcome to the very first episode of Interstate Odyssey. If you stick around, you might find some exciting new places to explore. I have no qualifications to host this podcast aside from my passion for road trips and research. Roadside attractions are the ultimate rabbit hole when it comes to doing research, and this week we're going to start with my favorite of them all, a place created by a man that became a local legend and created a house so mystifying that it became a roadside attraction without even trying. Messy, confusing, ugly, overwhelming, beautiful, campy, mystical, nightmarish. These are all words used in different headlines to describe House on the Rock. Personally, I think all of those words describe it perfectly. An hour south of Wisconsin Dells and just west of Milwaukee, nestled between Spring Green and Dodgeville, Wisconsin, sits a place that isn't just different, but truly extraordinary, the House on the Rock. If you live in the Midwest, you'll be sure to meet someone who has been to this infamous roadside attraction. People usually describe the place with a mix of wonder, confusion, and sometimes hesitation. Neil Gaiman called it the epicenter of the American gods, where Americana, folklore, and perhaps even magic intersect. He said that if he could figure out House on the Rock, then he could figure out America. Frank Lloyd Wright, just miles away in his home Toledo, was said to have denounced the place and its creator in a feud for the ages. It's a house filled with anomalies, excess, and fantastical items around every corner. Sort of like a living shrine dedicated to hedonism and the endless pursuit of more stuff. The Labyrinthine House snakes around the property, with 3 different buildings, housing things like priceless art from faraway lands and a record-setting carousel, a life-size sea monster, and animated music machines that will haunt your nightmares. It's the reason I decided to start a podcast about roadside attractions in the first place. Before the pandemic, my friends and I had been traveling around the United States, trying to find that same magic that I found the first time I went to the infamous house on Deer Shelter Rock, between Dodgeville and Spring Green. It really does feel magical, or mystical, or I don't know what, but I do know that I felt like I was on an acid trip for most of the time that I was there. So, it wasn't until I started doing research for this episode that I began to learn more about Spring Green and Dodgeville, Wisconsin. See, these 2 particular towns sit in an area of Wisconsin colloquially known as a place called the Driftless. This refers to the chaotic landscape and geography attributed to the glaciers not passing through and flattening this area, much like the rest of the plains. And I swear this sounds like it's straight out of a Stephen King novel, I know, but after coming across multiple accounts by locals, plus just being there myself, I tend to agree with the idea that there's sort of this strange and perhaps even supernatural energy to this place. House on the Rock is the most infamous of the anomalies found throughout Spring Green and Dodgeville, but that doesn't mean it's the only one. Places like Dr. Evermore's Sculpture Park, also called the Driftless Home. It's a park that boasts the world's largest scrap metal sculpture, combining scraps from things like the rocket Apollo 11 to Edison's electrical dynamos to form outlandish, larger-than-life pieces. Like House on the Rock, you can find similarly ambitious installations that represent plans of celestial ascension by way of whimsical, intricate machinery. I think I need to dedicate a full episode to talking specifically about Dr. Evermore, but other places in the general vicinity include points of interest like Ernest Houghton's Painted Forest, Nick Engelbert's Grandview, the Dickey Grotto, and the Don Q Inn. the latter being an otherworldly hotel, complete with themed rooms that transport guests to the location of their choice, featuring a moon landing room, an Arctic getaway complete with an actual igloo, and even a hot air balloon room. Even Frank Lloyd Wright's idyllic Taliesin couldn't remain unscathed in the Driftless, being infamous not only because it was the clandestine love nest of the architect, but because of the gruesome axe murders that happened there as well. But first, let's rewind. To get a good idea of House on the Rock, you have to first learn about its creator, Alex Jordan. His mythos is debated amongst locals. I don't think I've seen someone so consistently described by a mix of people, though. I've come across countless articles that all liken Alex Jordan to this unholy combination of P.T. Barnum, Donald Trump, and Walt Disney, a secretive creator with an extraordinary ability to spin fantastical tales out of pure bullshit. Others considered him this troubled embarrassment of a man who was given the house as a distraction from the rest of his high society family living east of there. He was born in 1914 in Madison, Wisconsin, to Mary Magdalena and Alex Jordan Sr. Jordan Sr. worked in construction and real estate. Evidently, that rubbed off on Jordan Jr. later in life. By the 1940s, Alex didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. His father had given him the responsibility of running Villa Maria, a property used for women's housing at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This clearly left him feeling unfulfilled but full of ideas, a tried-and-true recipe for the inception of cults, religions, and roadside attractions. He floated from job to job, but not a whole lot is confirmed about his earlier years. Alex Jordan Jr. is a lot like the house he created, a mixture of creative mythos with little authenticity actually present. This is actually my second time recording this episode, specifically because when I let my friends hear the first demo, the first note that they all gave me was that they wanted to hear more details about the creator, Alex Jordan Jr. I really had to do some digging to get a full picture of what this guy was like because, quite frankly, his identity was built on grandiosity and stretching the truth. That same sentiment was echoed on reviews of House on the Rock, with people lamenting the fact that they had no idea who this weirdo was and felt like they had no context behind the house's construction. That might have been by design, however. Alex Jordan Jr. was someone who clearly wanted recognition for his creations, but would always opt out of interviews of news pieces that wished to cover him and the house. Perhaps this is because he wanted the house to speak for itself, or who knows, maybe he was just kind of terrible on camera. I think more than anything is that I thought of him as kind of this prototype for a modern-day internet troll. From the research that I did on him, it seems like nothing made him happier than fooling people into believing a fake was the real thing. Marv Belusic, author of the unauthorized biography of Alex Jordan, was quoted saying that he actually thought that Alex would be willing to pay more for a replica of something than the real deal, simply because he could stand behind the proverbial curtain and laugh as he watched people get hoodwinked. He generally seemed to have just a totally contrarian personality. Alex Jordan Jr. drove around in a car that looked like it was something out of the retro-futuristic Fifth Element, made out of a body and running gear from a 1930s Cadillac Roadster, along with other mismatched pieces. This car was cartoonishly large and always created a spectacle when he drove it through town. Alex also intimated that this car had previously belonged to Ann Sheridan, a popular movie star of the 1940s. Clearly, he had a penchant for stretching the truth. I also mentioned before that some people believe that Alex Jordan Jr. was given the house on the rock as a distraction by his family. Marv Belusic stated in his unauthorized biography that Alex Jordan Sr. was the one who had actually begun working on the house and gave it to Jr. because he had just been involved in an embarrassing scandal in their home of Madison, Wisconsin. In 1939, Alex had been arrested because of a failed attempt at blackmail. Allegedly, Alex Jordan Jr. secretly took photos of a man having sex with his then-girlfriend, Jenny Olson, and they used those photos to blackmail the unnamed man into paying up. It didn't work, and they were arrested, mugshots posted all over Madison. According to Marv Belusic, that was the real catalyst for the house's construction. I think even more illuminating than the sensational stories that are in Belusic's wildly unflattering expose on Alex, the striking resentment and distaste he had for Alex is illuminating. Like, what on earth could he have been like to deserve such a calculated thrashing from a contemporary? One of the things we do know for sure, however, is that he began building the house on the rock in 1948. This was supposedly 2 decades after the legendary feud between him and Frank Lloyd Wright, the beloved Midwestern architect and the godfather of prairie-style architecture known throughout the world. As the legend goes, well, actually according to one of Alex's colleagues/frenemies, Sid Boyum, at some time in the late 1910s, Frank Lloyd Wright saw the plans for Jordan's Villa Maria and told him, "I wouldn't hire you to design a cheese crate or a chicken coop. You're not capable." And as Jordan drove home from his nasty encounter with his childhood hero, he pointed to a spire of rock off of Highway 23 and proclaimed, "I'm going to build a Japanese house on one of those pinnacle rocks and advertise it." And the rest was history. Except it wasn't. If this story had actually occurred in the 1910s or even the early 1920s, Jordan Jr. would have been a young child. Plus, Villa Maria wasn't even built by the Jordans, but instead by another well-known architect of the era, Frank Riley. Another hole in the story is that Wright was actually in Japan during much of this time period, and unrelated, this was around the same time as the Taliesin axe murders where his mistress was killed. One more fun fact. The guy who made this story up in the first place, Sid Boyum, took great pride in the fact that he was a world champion liar, recognized by the Burlington Liars Club in 1976. The reality is less incendiary than the legend, but no less interesting. Stories like these swirled around the house on the rock during pre- and post-construction. From 1948 to mid-1950, Alex constructed the first of his 3 houses on Deer Shelter Rock. The space was an addition on top of an addition on top of an addition, the initial building being reminiscent of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie style with Japanese influences. I saw a really good piece that talked about the style of this first house, and they likened it to more of almost a kabuki style with very campy, chintzy pieces and elements tying together the place that you definitely would never find in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Deer Shelter Rock was in a position that was visible from the road, so naturally, curious onlookers became interested in the building. For 50 cents, he would allow passerby to come and look at the space as he continued construction. By 1959, folklore around the mysterious house on the rock hit a fever pitch, and Alex capitalized on the interest. He charged a small fee to tour the house, and a stone marker was placed on Highway 23 to entice more curious drivers. From then on, the house on the rock became a local wonder and continued to morph and grow into the early 1990s when construction was finally kind of finished. And I should mention as well, there is a much lesser known but far more significant falling out that Alex was involved in during the construction of House on the Rock. Dr. Evermore, who ran Dr. Evermore's sculpture park, was actually named Tom Every. He and Alex had a close working relationship, with Tom often using the house on the rock as a place to display new creations, continually helping to fill the house and fulfill Alex's vision. Nobody knows much about the contentious falling out, other than that it was a crushing blow to Tom Every. In spite of this, the schism spawned the sculpture park that he's now famous for. The entire construction of House on the Rock seems fraught with conflict and personal battles waged between Alex and many of his colleagues. Alex didn't just stop at the first house. A decade later, in 1968, he decided to build the mill house onto the existing house, boasting one of the world's largest fireplaces. Many of his attractions had a Barnum-like hyperbole to them. Nothing was ever just interesting or curious. It had to be the biggest, brightest, and best in the world. And let me be clear, though it's the most normal part of the entire attraction, this place is satisfyingly weird. Walls of bookcases and fake Millefiori paperweights and Tiffany glass juxtaposed with exposed rock and at times literal waterfalls springing out from the ceilings make for an unforgettable experience that fascinates in any era. In a way, the place is like walking through an incredibly intricate old movie set. Like I mentioned before, Alex Jordan Jr. lived for a good replica. Though the lamps look to be Tiffany, they're actually made by Bauer & Coble, a firm out of Illinois. Eventually, his fun with passing off replicas as the real deal came to an end in the mid-70s when he began seeing some backlash for his, artistic liberties. Apparently, we have a disgruntled employee to thank for exposing that the Tiffany glass lamps were actually Bauer & Coble replicas. After this happened, the information plaques had to come down. They kind of ran with this though, and they took up this hyperbolic stance that honestly reminds me of Donald Trump, because on brochures in the 1990s, they stated that the house, and I quote, boasts the largest collection of Bauer & Coble lamps in the world. The management considers them finer and expects them to be more valuable than Tiffany. The entire attraction feels like you're looking at the inside of a person's brain, with their wildest imaginations, fears, and desires transposed into a series of maze-like houses. Next came the haunting attraction, The Streets of Yesterday, which transports viewers into an expansive, immersive Victorian-era street that is perpetually suspended in nighttime. People often compare this to the Milwaukee Museum's attraction, The Streets of Old Milwaukee, and they're exactly right. House on the Rock basically used that exhibit as their blueprint. I will say though, one of the most disorienting things about House on the Rock is how dark it is. The Streets of Yesterday have ceilings painted to look like the night sky, with swaths of bare tree branches covering the faux skyline above the buildings. It's almost like a haunted version of the massive pink skies on the ceiling of the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. I wouldn't call any of this particularly realistic or even informative, but it kind of acts as an immersive installation. I should also note that none of the attractions seem to have windows, or real ones, that is. So, when you exit a house, daylight truly feels disorienting. Throughout the Streets of Yesterday, you're invited to look into dimly lit shop windows featuring vignettes of yesteryear, old-timey dentist's office, apothecaries, and inexplicably rooms full of ancient-looking dolls and buggies. I suppose I will give that to the 1-star Yelp reviews that I saw when researching this place. It is filled with creepy stuff, and to more disgruntled guests' credit, you would not think that's the case when seeing their nicely articulated gardens and welcome center at the beginning of the experience. The most popular and probably most well-known attraction is the first one that visitors will encounter, though it wasn't built until the 1970s, and that's the Infinity Walk. A long, narrow hallway that ends at an incredibly narrow point allows guests to look out into the expansive forestry that surrounds the house. The Infinity Walk seems decently sturdy, but it's known to sway slightly on windy days or when many visitors are walking around that set of rooms. It's definitely a surreal experience to go down a narrow glass hallway that you feel like might collapse at any moment, but there's a lot of windows and it's not pitch black or filled with mannequins, so I would give this part of the house the award for being the most kid-friendly. The next set of rooms Jordan constructed was the Music of Yesterday, boasting larger-than-life music machines made of seemingly thousands of individual nuts and bolts and wires that connected to a brigade of instruments. When a coin is inserted into one of these monstrous installations, the entirety of it begins to shake and move as if the instruments were really being operated by the wires and strings they were connected to. The music is deafening, in spite of the fact that the walls are covered floor to ceiling with blood-red carpeting. Though the workmanship of these machines seems impressive, they don't in fact actually play music mechanically, but have a speaker behind the machine playing pre-recorded music that matches up quite well with the crescendos and cymbal claps and drum beats. The section is definitely the one that I'm surprised kids are always milling around in, because I know for a fact that if I was a kid and my parents brought me here, this would probably be the room where I'd fully lose my shit. I cannot accurately describe how jarring it is to go from complete silence to deafening, out-of-tune versions of different classical pieces. In some ways, I suppose I can now identify with the fear a dog feels when a vacuum cleaner is turned on near them, because that's the closest I can come to describing it. Allegedly, there was a machine called the Orchestrion that produced the actual sounds of these machines, and seriously, look it up, they're absolutely fascinating, but They sold theirs years ago, so now it's just playing recordings over them. Between having no windows, a maze-like layout, and an inability to go back from where you started, makes this portion of the house overwhelming, to say the least. All three houses are self-guided and have very little chaperoning. The first time I went, it seemed as though their hiring pool consisted only of people who were either 100 or 14 years old, with one or two of them at the entrance and exit of each house. You could go for stretches of 20 or 30 minutes without seeing another person, a living person, that is. I asked one of the young workers if he ever felt scared when he was working here, and he said, "Only at night, when you have to close up. Then it's pretty creepy." That's an understatement. The next set of houses created were the Carousel House and the Heritage of the Sea. Even though I've been to this attraction 3 separate times, I still get tripped up trying to visualize what the entire layout of this place is. From the outside, it looks like a nice house with a large welcome center and ramps snaking around the property. The inside seems vast and never-ending, giving off this vibe that is literally the exact opposite of the tranquil Japanese gardens outside. The Heritage of the Sea is the home of the life-size sea monster, complete with a fisherman's boat inside of its massive mouth. The sea monster, that looks a lot like a really angry giant sperm whale, is trapped in an endless battle with a giant squid, which you can look at from eye level or up above on scaffolding that feels precarious at best. Something that I should also mention, in Marv Belusic's takedown story of Alex Jordan Jr., he definitely tried to cancel him because of all of the rampant OSHA violations that were going on at House on the Rock. Unclear if they've fixed those since then, but it's definitely something to think about. For some reason, the scale of the sea monster really triggered something in my animal brain, and I was freaked out. I didn't want to walk past it, and I didn't want to get too close to it, even though I knew it wasn't real. This thing is 200 feet tall and 300 feet long. That's double the length and width of a football field. You can't fully comprehend those measurements till you're looking at it, I swear. Not to mention, this is all happening with the background music of a very, very broken down machine playing Octopus's Garden painfully out of tune. Inside this area, the walls are lined with dining menus from cruise ships of the early 1900s, like the Titanic and Queen Mary. Curiously, there are no plaques or markers describing what artifacts you're looking at. You kind of just have to make up your own stories and take in the visuals. You might notice small squares that stay unbleached from the fluorescent lights, giving away that plaques did once occupy the space. This was not an accident. Like I mentioned before, Alex Jordan's greatest joy in life was taking artistic liberties with his trinkets that he imported from faraway lands and times of yesteryear. That's kind of a theme of House on the Rock. It's all just a bunch of shiny, exciting things that happen to be of little value. He claimed at one point that a display case full of plasticky costume jewelry were actually the priceless crown jewels from Queen Victoria herself. They were actually replicas made in the 1970s by a fellow Wisconsinite. He took the same liberties with a now nameless carving of ivory that was not made in India by an unknown artisan, as the plaque formerly stated, but instead by a local Wisconsin artisan named Richard Ron. The piece was titled The Tusk of Ranchipur. It was a play on the phrase, Ron is poor, because Ron allegedly never got paid for the commissioned piece. At this point, I feel like I've described a ton of different spaces, but I'm barely halfway through. If you're feeling like you don't want to go to see this place simply because I've described so much of it, please fight that feeling. I promise no amount of description or preparation will do the House on the Rock justice. No amount of pictures from the inside of the 3 houses correctly depict the vastness and labyrinthine qualities that it holds. In spite of the fact that I've spent all of this time describing it, it is truly indescribable and inexplicable. Now that I've gotten that disclaimer out of the way, I'll finish with the pièce de résistance, the carousel. It's like something out of a dream or perhaps a nightmare. Remember when I mentioned the Driftless earlier? Tom Every, or Dr. Evermore, was actually behind the creation of arguably the most impressive aspect of the entire house. Encrusted with 20,000 red bulbs and glowing lights, with 269 animals, the carousel takes up your entire field of vision. It rotates quickly with no riders. The carousel, just like most other things in House on the Rock, is fake. Instead of rotating at the base, it merely turns with only the front half visible. Although it's only a mirage, it's incredible to say the least. Fantastic beasts whirl past, and if you look closely, you'll notice not a single horse is present, but instead, lions, tigers, unicorns, and even a pug. If you're disappointed by the lack of horses, don't worry. Another room boasts the most retired carousel horses in one place. It's literally a massive wall of horses. The ceiling of the carousel room looks to be replete with angels on high, but don't look too close. They're actually female mannequins with wings glued onto their back. It's almost too overwhelming to notice that the only way to enter through the next room is through the mouth of a dragon. Not gonna lie, the first time I went, just like the sea monster, I was afraid to walk through the dragon's mouth. I genuinely don't understand how little kids can just race through this place completely unfazed. I just think of what a giant baby I was as a kid and how I would have absolutely not gone through that dragon mouth. Really, I was convinced that something would jump out at me, and between the deafening bass drums and carnival sounds, you start to feel like you can't trust your own thoughts. By the time you're in this area, you've probably been experiencing the house for almost 2 hours, so you're really just trying to process all of the oncoming stimuli. The room that the dragon's mouth leads into is where you can start to tell that Alex Jordan's mind was beginning to unravel. Some attribute this to the passing of his parents in the late 60s, which shook the foundation that the house had been created on, with Alex Jordan Jr.'s parents being heavily involved in the financial dealings of the house. When Alex's devoutly Catholic mother died in 1969, he removed all overtly Catholic iconography, including stations of the cross that formerly greeted guests at the entrance of the house, clearly affected by this loss. The other rooms feel as though they have themes to them, with conscious visions connecting them together. The last rooms feel like a perverse fever dream that feels like a combination of Dante's Inferno and Eyes Wide Shut. Stanley Kubrick's last film didn't come out until after Alex Jordan Jr. had died, but my God, they probably would have had some very interesting conversations just from their similarities in aesthetic choices alone. Fully nude mannequins with goat heads intertwine with other mannequins sporting unicorn heads as they all rotate on massive carousels. As an added bonus, these carousels are also occupied by hundreds, honestly, maybe thousands of porcelain dolls. Impish ventriloquist dummies and puppets line the walls, looking like they could reanimate at a moment's notice, as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse look down at you from above. Rooms that look like forests from a 1970s fantasy movie weave through even more music machines, including a full orchestra of mannequins that supposedly play Beethoven. I say supposedly because this particular setup was broken when I was there. That was another one of my favorite parts of House on the Rock, ironically. The space hasn't really been renovated since the early 90s, and if the machines break, then they're seemingly broken for good. Without any maintenance, all 3 houses feel like a dusty time capsule, completely detached from the technology and efficiency of 2020s. Some rooms have a Night at the Museum quality, if Night at the Museum was actually a horror movie. You feel like you shouldn't be there, and in some areas you could easily climb into the exhibits of knights fighting on horses or lions on the savannah, since there's no glass between you and the displays. I don't recommend doing that though. I can't stress this enough. Nobody is guiding you through this place. Like, for real, nobody is watching you for better or worse. It's almost completely self-guided after the first house. I think this is a reason that sometimes guests are polarized against House on the Rock. People keep comparing him to Frank Lloyd Wright, and this place to the tours that are given in Taliesin, which, in my opinion, is a disservice to both of these creators. I've seen so many TripAdvisor and Yelp reviews saying, "Don't waste your money, the Frank Lloyd Wright tour is better." And to that I say, well, of course it is, if you're looking for an in-depth history and background about prairie-style architecture. Proximity is really the only thing that these two share in common. That, and perhaps the influences that Alex drew from Wright's architectural style. Other than that, I feel like comparing the two is like saying, the planetarium is much more informative than the Legoland down the street, don't waste your time there. Which, you're not wrong, but why are you even comparing them? What I'm really trying to say is that this place is a marvel, more akin to an acid trip than a traditional museum or historical tour experience. And trust me, I get it. The zero supervision aspect can be particularly confusing because many of the rooms are warehouse-sized and filled with maze-like ramps snaking up and down around the space, so at times you have to commit to a path and just kind of see where it takes you. The whole place feels like an idealistic dream that inadvertently was warped over time into a macabre nightmare. The space is truly cinematic. And once you go there, you'll feel like every eclectic set design featured in a movie was taking notes from the house on Deer Shelter Rock. The Raconteurs and 10,000 Maniacs evidently agree with me because they both filmed music videos there. The carousel and one of the fortune tellers was even used in a few scenes of the TV adaptation of the novel American Gods. I could explain this house for as long as it takes someone to tour the entire space, but I won't, I promise. Though this anachronistic, disjointed arrangement of attractions already seems like an overwhelming amount to take in, I haven't even mentioned many of the other themed corridors that guide you forward. Seriously, you cannot turn back in this place. Once you're in there for the long haul. Even when you're in the bathroom, you can't escape the collections of headless mannequins and trinkets lining the walls. There's a miniature circus replica room with an incredibly large collection of miniature circus attractions encased in glass. Though this seems pretty run-of-the-mill for a roadside attraction, remember that the only light provided is from the circus setup itself as you walk down these endless, deadly quiet hallways. There's another room of seemingly hundreds of miniatures in vignettes ranging from everyday occurrences like families sitting in front of a fireplace to a tiny layout of a man in a bedroom with an even tinier shotgun propped up against his mouth. At some point, this melts into a room filled with guns in glass cases, each one looking more physically impossible than the next. Because they are. Some have upwards of 10 barrels attached to the handle, others are comically large and ornate, and there's literally one attached to a wooden leg. Other transitional hallways are filled with random toys, freakish-looking marionette puppets with warped Punch and Judy faces, Venetian masks lining the walls, seemingly staring at you from every angle. There's a camera room, a room full of old-timey light-up coin slot machines that tell you things like what kind of lover you are, and a Rube Goldberg machine that actually operates. Sometimes. In this same room, there's even a plane engine that allegedly belonged to Charles Lindbergh. Given what we know about the rest of the house at this point, this factoid must be taken with a grain of salt. There's an exotic animal room, lions, tigers, knights on horses. It feels kind of like the Field Museum in Chicago if the Field Museum was completely abandoned, unsupervised, and had zero distancing measures between you and the actual displays. Like, this room is really weird because you could absolutely climb into one of those attractions if you wanted. Again, I don't recommend it though. When you finally leave the last house, you feel dazed, like you just woke up from a dream. Inexplicably, there's a small shop selling fudge that you can end your trip at. Personally, I didn't feel hungry, especially for fudge, but it at least seems like an attempt at normalcy after the surreal experience that you've spent the last 3 hours on. After we were done with the entire experience, the drive home was basically my boyfriend and I saying after long pauses of contemplation, "Do you remember the dolls, or the tile-covered Cadillac, or that random restaurant in the middle of the place?" And nodding in a dazed manner as if we were trying to piece together the wild events of a party the night before. Like I said before, this really is my favorite roadside attraction and one that really captures this perfect oddity and veneer that so many roadside attractions seem to share. This one really has a feel to it with its excess and artifice that it seems to embody a part of American history, kind of like the circuses of the late 1800s or the pop art movement of the 1960s. You get to peek into a different world, but You can't look too close or you'll see what's really behind the curtain. Plus, in a place that big, you can really get lost. Eventually, Alex Jordan sold the house on the rock to Art Donaldson, the owner of a roadside advertising company called Vivid Inc. Jordan had been making plans to sell the house as early as the 1970s after suffering a serious heart attack in 1964, though his construction on the house didn't wind down until at least the mid-70s. In 1988, Art Donaldson officially purchased House on the Rock. A year later, in 1989, Alex Jordan passed away. However, if you happen to find yourself on Highway 23 in southwest Wisconsin, you can still look into a corner of his mind at House on the Rock and decide if it's the architecture of a visionary, a swindler, a madman, or all three. But don't worry, technically Alex Jordan Jr. is still there. In true Alex Jordan Jr. fashion, shortly after his death, his ashes were spread all over the property in a low-flying plane. And seriously, I cannot stress enough how much this place needs to be seen to be believed. It doesn't disappoint, and during the pandemic, they're still allowing a limited amount of masked visitors, even though I don't recommend traveling during the pandemic. This place has questionable ventilation at best, but on their website it said they're taking extra precautions to keep the place sanitary, so it's up to your own level of risk. Another important tip is to show up in the morning if you can, well before 3 p.m., because that's when they stop letting people in for the day, because you literally can't get through this place in less than 2 hours. And, don't forget, if you like this story and you want to hear about more places, please review, rate, and like this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Next week, we'll be covering one of the most haunted places in the world, according to Time magazine, the Winchester House. This has been a transmission of Interstate Odyssey, Episode 1.